Every silent glance conceals a challenge. Every whispered remark hides a story of defiance. In this riveting tale of courage and transformation, Elijah Carter dares to stand against a world built on exclusion and prejudice. For more powerful stories that inspire and ignite the spirit, hit subscribe and join the journey. Now, dive into the battle of resilience at Willow Creek High. Elijah Carter stepped off the bus with his mother, Monica, into the quiet, sun-dappled streets of Willow Creek. The town, with its neat lawns and modest houses, promised a fresh start, one where the shadows of past hurts might finally fade. Monica's hopeful eyes shone as she carried the weight of their meager belongings. She believed that this new chapter would bring healing and stability. But for Elijah, every step on the pavement evoked memories of a life he had long wished to leave behind. A subtle tremor of anxiety mixed with the dull ache of regret as he surveyed the neighborhood, noticing furtive glances from passers-by and the delicate rustling of curtains that betrayed silent judgments. While Monica talked animatedly about the opportunities this place might offer, Elijah's mind raced with apprehension. He recalled previous moves, the bitter loneliness, the feeling of being an outsider, and the unspoken prejudices that always lingered beneath the surface. As they unloaded their boxes in the back of a battered sedan, a chill of déjà vu ran through him. The neighbors' curious stares, though polite on the surface, carried an edge of suspicion. Every whispered word and sideways glance confirmed what he had long suspected. Willow Creek was a town with unyielding traditions and a quiet intolerance for change. That night, lying on his creaky bed in a modest, half-furnished room, Elijah's thoughts swirled like a storm. The darkness outside his window seemed to close in, mirroring the isolation he felt inside. In that silence, he mentally braced himself for the inevitable challenge of adapting to another school, another community that might never fully accept him. The fear of rejection had become a constant companion, but so too had a quiet determination to carve out a space for himself, even if it meant confronting the ghosts of his past. He resolved that this new beginning would not be marked by defeat, even if the price was a battle for every small victory. The gentle hum of the night was punctuated by the rhythmic tapping of rain on the roof, as if nature itself was whispering secrets of endurance. In that fragile moment, the promise of a fresh start battled with the weight of painful memories. Elijah understood that every new beginning came with its own set of challenges. His heart, though heavy with apprehension, was also kindling with a spark of resilience. It was this spark that would soon set in motion a chain of events that neither Willow Creek nor its inhabitants could have predicted, a journey that would test his limits and transform him in ways he had never imagined. The following morning, the corridors of Willow Creek High were a maze of unfamiliar faces and hushed conversations. As Elijah walked through the front doors, the sterile smell of freshly waxed floors and the murmur of morning greetings did little to quell his inner turmoil. The principal's introduction, delivered with a rehearsed smile, seemed to mark him as an anomaly among the clusters of students who exchanged glances and half-hearted smiles. Despite the cheerful decor of the school, an unspoken divide was immediately evident, a silent consensus that Elijah was not one of them. During his first class, every stifled laugh and whispered comment felt like a pointed reminder of his outsider status. The other students, each absorbed in their own cliques, eyed him with a mix of curiosity and caution. He sat at the back of the classroom, meticulously arranging his books and trying to blend into the background. Yet, it was impossible to ignore the magnetic pull of attention that emanated from Lucas Harrington, a charismatic senior whose effortless charm made him the undisputed golden boy of the school. Lucas's presence was impossible to overlook. His confident smile and well-practiced wave exuded an unspoken authority that both fascinated and unnerved Elijah. At lunch, Elijah sought refuge in the solitude of a corner table. He scanned the bustling cafeteria, taking in the groups animatedly chatting about weekend plans and the latest gossip. In that moment, his eyes locked with Lucas's. There was a fleeting spark of recognition, an unreadable glance that seemed to measure him up before flicking away into a cold reserve. That brief encounter was laden with unspoken challenges. It was as if Lucas was silently declaring, "You don't belong here." And Elijah, through his silent acceptance of that judgment, realized that the battle for his identity in this new world had only just begun. The divide wasn't simply about physical space. It was woven into the fabric of every interaction, every glance, every whispered comment. In between classes, as Elijah moved silently down the halls, he became increasingly aware of the social barriers that segregated him from the vibrant, yet exclusive, core of the student body. Even in moments of casual conversation, the invisible line was drawn clearly. He was the new kid, the anomaly, the outsider. With every step, his heart pounded not just with fear, but with a determined resolve to find his place in a world that was quick to judge on appearances and old prejudices. As the bell rang signaling the end of the day, Elijah left the school with a heavy mixture of sorrow and defiance. The unspoken divide, both painful and palpable, had been established. In that moment, he silently vowed to himself that he would not be defined by the narrow expectations of others. He would find a way to bridge the gap, or if necessary, forge a new path entirely. A path that would prove that true worth was never measured by acceptance from the indifferent majority. In the days that followed, the undercurrents of hostility at Willow Creek High began to reveal themselves in small, yet unmistakable, ways. Elijah's initial sense of isolation was compounded by subtle acts of cruelty that started to punctuate his daily routine. One morning, as he walked down a long, echoing corridor between classes, a sudden shove nearly sent him sprawling. Though the incident was dismissed by onlookers as a mere accident, the timing and force left no room for doubt. It was a deliberate act meant to unsettle him. Each shove, every whispered remark, stitched together a pattern of hostility that was as calculated as it was insidious. By mid-morning, a crumpled note found its way onto his desk in history class. The message, scrawled in jagged handwriting, read simply, "You lost. This isn't your school." The note was a clear, unambiguous message from those who viewed him as an interloper. Elijah's heart sank at the sight, yet he kept his face neutral. Each time he scanned the room, he noted the furtive glances and stifled giggles exchanged by classmates. The silent alliance of exclusion was building a barrier around him, one that was both physical and psychological. Throughout the day, there were more small signs of trouble. His locker, once a safe space to store his books and personal effects, was tampered with. Some of his belongings were misplaced or deliberately scattered, as if an unseen hand was determined to destabilize his already fragile sense of security. In the cafeteria, while others laughed and chatted, a chill of isolation wrapped around him like a second skin. Every time his eyes met those of his peers, there was an unspoken language of disdain, a clear indication that his presence was unwelcome. Elijah's inner world was a storm of conflicting emotions. The pain of exclusion battled with a growing determination to withstand the pressure. Rather than retaliating, he chose silence. He believed that every act of aggression was a test of his resolve, a challenge to his very identity. Instead of lashing out, he meticulously observed his tormentors, memorizing their habits and timing. He wondered if understanding the pattern might eventually reveal a way to disarm them. This silent observation became a form of self-defense, a way to reclaim control over a situation that threatened to strip him of his dignity. The whispers in the hallways grew louder as the week progressed. Every time Elijah passed by, he felt the cold, piercing eyes of those who secretly celebrated his discomfort. Yet with each encounter, the seed of resistance within him took root. Even as the notes, the shoves, and the vandalism escalated, he began to realize that there was strength in enduring, in not giving the bullies the satisfaction of a reaction. His pain was private. His resolve, though tested daily, was slowly transforming into something unyielding. As the final bell of the day rang, signaling the end of another long, torment-filled day, Elijah walked home with a heavy heart, but also with a budding resolve. The early signs of trouble had not broken him. Instead, they had sharpened his awareness of the battle he was forced to fight, a battle not only for acceptance but for the right to define who he truly was. With every cruel whisper and every hostile gesture, he felt more determined to stand firm and prepare for the challenges that lay ahead. That crisp autumn afternoon, as the golden hues of sunset spilled across the sidewalks, Elijah found himself cornered just outside the school building. The day had been like any other, a series of silent torments and hushed insults. but nothing had prepared him for what was to come. As he walked alone, lost in thoughts of solitude and resignation, a group of figures emerged from the gathering dusk. At their forefront was Lucas Harrington, his eyes glinting with a mix of mischief and menace. Flanked by a small crew of well-built students, Lucas exuded a dangerous confidence that made the very air around him seem charged. Lucas stepped forward with a smirk that was equal parts amusement and scorn. "New kid," he drawled, his voice dripping with condescension. "Thought you'd just fade away, didn't you?" His words were not so much spoken as they were imposed on the silence between them. One of the taller, burly boys, Brandon, cracked his knuckles in a silent warning, the sound echoing in the quiet twilight. For a long moment, the only sound was the distant hum of traffic and the soft rustle of falling leaves, as if nature itself was holding its breath. Elijah felt a familiar tension knot his stomach. He knew that this was the moment he had been silently dreading for weeks. Every sneer, every disparaging glance from the halls of Willow Creek High had led him to this very confrontation. Yet, as the circle of adversaries tightened around him, he felt neither panic nor anger. Instead, he adopted a steely calm, a practiced composure that belied the storm raging inside. His eyes, dark and resolute, met Lucas's with an unspoken challenge, and for a few agonizing seconds, the world stood still. There was an almost palpable electricity in the air, as if every heart in the surrounding buildings was attuned to the imminent showdown. Lucas's taunts continued, each word intended to provoke a reaction, to force Elijah to break his silence. "What's the matter, Carter? Cat got your tongue?" he jeered, the words echoing like a cruel refrain. But Elijah, drawing on a reservoir of inner strength forged by years of isolation and endurance, simply stared back. His silence was a defiant proclamation. He would not give them the satisfaction of a reaction. For a long moment, the tension hung like a heavy fog. The bullies' faces shifted from confident malice to uncertainty. They had expected tears, anger, or perhaps a retort that would feed their cruelty. Instead, Elijah's unwavering gaze left them momentarily confused, their plans faltering in the face of his determined calm. In that silent standoff, every student who had ever doubted him, every sneer, and every whispered insult seemed to vanish, leaving only the stark reality of a boy determined to reclaim his dignity. Then, without a word, Elijah turned and walked away, leaving the group in stunned silence. The confrontation was far from over in their minds, yet his act of non-engagement had shifted something fundamental in the balance of power. As he disappeared into the gathering dusk, a quiet promise resonated in the chill evening air. This was only the beginning of a long, hard-fought battle for respect, one that Elijah was prepared to fight on his own terms. In the weeks that followed that fateful encounter, the undercurrent of hostility at Willow Creek High evolved into a more deliberate, systematic campaign of intimidation. The bullies, led by Lucas and his cronies, escalated their tactics from mere verbal jabs and sidelong glances to a series of calculated pranks designed to strip away Elijah's confidence. It began with small, unsettling acts, a missing notebook, a misplaced set of keys, and cryptic graffiti scrawled in the corners of empty hallways. Every day, as Elijah navigated the labyrinthine corridors of the school, he found that the invisible lines drawn by his tormentors had grown sharper, more defined. One afternoon, as he settled into a classroom that smelled faintly of dust and old textbooks, Elijah discovered that his chair had mysteriously vanished. In its place was a hastily scribbled message, barely legible, yet chilling in its intent. Across the locker-lined walls, someone had scrawled his name alongside derogatory symbols, as though branding him as an outcast for all to see. The humiliation stung deeply, yet Elijah maintained his composure. In the quiet solitude of his thoughts, he reflected on the unwritten rules of power that governed these interactions. Silence was often misinterpreted as weakness, yet sometimes it was the strongest weapon against those who sought to provoke. Each act of vandalism, each furtive note slipped into his backpack, became a silent conversation, a dialogue in which Elijah's stoicism was both his shield and his statement. But as the pranks grew bolder, the stakes grew higher. One particularly disheartening evening, after a long day of enduring subtle yet unrelenting bullying, Elijah returned home to find his belongings rearranged, his favorite book torn at the edges, and a crudely drawn symbol scrawled on the wall of his small room. The act was public, meant to signal his vulnerability to everyone who cared to look. Yet, in that moment of despair, something within him stirred, a spark of defiance that refused to be snuffed out. Determined to reclaim control over his life, Elijah began to channel his frustration into discipline. In the quiet solitude of his garage, with only the echo of his own breathing and the rhythmic sound of a heavy bag being pounded, he discovered a solace in physical training. Every punch, every disciplined movement, became a meditation, a reaffirmation of his self-worth that could not be diminished by petty cruelty. The gym became both a sanctuary and a proving ground, where every drop of sweat was a silent vow. He would not allow the cruelty of others to define him. As word of the escalating pranks spread through the school, whispers turned to murmurs of both fear and grudging respect. Some students began to see in Elijah a resilience that was rare, a quiet strength that shone through even in the face of relentless adversity. Teachers, too, started to notice the change in his demeanor, a mix of stoicism and determination that hinted at a transformation in progress. And though the bullies continued their daily campaign of intimidation, their actions were now met with a steadfast silence that spoke louder than any retort could have. In the dim light of another autumn evening, as Elijah wrapped his aching knuckles and prepared for another night of training, he reflected on the unwritten rules of power. He had learned that the battle was not always won by force of fists or shouts, but by the silent resolve to endure and the quiet determination to rise above. And so, with every swing of the heavy bag, he was not only honing his body, but forging a spirit that would soon defy the very expectations of those who sought to break him. One chilly morning, as fog still clung to the edges of the school grounds like a ghostly shroud, Elijah arrived at Willow Creek high only to confront a sight that chilled him to the bone. Along the side of the aging brick building, a bold, hateful message was spray-painted in stark, unforgiving black letters. The slur, a venomous racial epithet, marred the otherwise pristine facade of the school, a public declaration of intolerance meant to degrade and humiliate. For a heartbeat, time seemed to freeze. The once familiar walls now loomed as symbols of exclusion, their surfaces stained not just with paint, but with the bitterness of prejudice. Students gathered in hushed clusters, their voices reduced to anxious whispers. The teachers scrambled in a panic, hastily attempting to scrub away the blight. But even as the layers of toxic paint were removed, the message's impact lingered, a stark reminder that the insidious hatred was not so easily washed away. In the midst of the chaos, Monica rushed to Elijah's side. Her eyes, brimming with worry and sorrow, pleaded with him to let her intervene, to accept the comfort of a protective embrace in the face of such cruelty. But Elijah, his expression hardened by long-practiced resolve, gently pushed her concern aside. "I'll handle it," he said softly, though the tremor in his voice betrayed the depth of his pain. That morning marked a turning point. The racial slur was more than just an act of vandalism. It was an attack on his very identity, a public declaration that his presence was not welcome, that he was somehow less than others in this community. The humiliation and anger swirled together within him, igniting a fire that he had long kept in check. Each hateful stroke of the spray can had chipped away at the fragile veneer of acceptance he had desperately clung to, leaving behind a raw determination to stand tall, no matter the cost. As the day progressed, the atmosphere in the school grew heavy with unspoken tension. Every classroom, every hallway, bore the invisible scars of that morning's cruelty. Even those who had once passed by in indifferent silence now cast sidelong, pained glances in his direction. But rather than succumbing to despair, Elijah's spirit hardened. He understood that the hate displayed on that wall was a reflection of a deeper societal fracture, a fracture that he was now compelled to mend, not through retaliation, but through a fierce assertion of his dignity. In the quiet solitude of the school library later that day, as Elijah pored over books on history and philosophy, he contemplated the true meaning of power. True strength, he realized, was not found in the physical ability to strike back, but in the resilience to rise above hatred and prejudice. The incident had forced him to confront not just the cruelty of others, but also his own doubts about his capacity to effect change. And in that reflective moment, he made a solemn vow. He would not allow the venom of racism to define his future. He would forge a new path, a path that transcended the narrow confines of prejudice, a path that celebrated the worth of every individual. That evening, as twilight fell and the world grew quiet, Elijah stepped out into the cool night air with a renewed determination. Every hateful message, every act of cruelty, had pushed him closer to the breaking point, but it had also steeled his resolve. In the face of such overwhelming darkness, he would be the light that refused to be snuffed out, a beacon of hope and resilience in a world too often marred by intolerance. Later that week, as the cool whisper of night replaced the harsh glare of day, Elijah's routine journey home from school took an unexpected turn. With every step, his mind replayed the earlier events. Each insult, each act of cruelty had chipped away at the old, passive version of himself. Now, as he made his way down a dimly lit side street, the sound of approaching footsteps broke the silence. He didn't need to glance back to know who was following him. The familiar cadence of those steps, the heavy tread, was unmistakable. Without warning, a small circle of figures emerged from the shadows. At the forefront stood Lucas, his face illuminated by a cruel, self-assured smirk, flanked by Brandon and two others whose expressions flickered between malice and anticipation. Lucas's presence signified a new phase in their silent war. Their eyes burned with the thrill of a challenge. This was no longer a casual harassment, but a deliberate, premeditated ambush designed to force Elijah's hand. The tension in the cool night air was palpable. Lucas's voice, low and mocking, broke the silence. "You think you're tough now, Carter? You think you can stand up to us?" His taunt was laced with scorn, as if daring Elijah to defy the unspoken hierarchy of the school. For a long moment, time seemed to slow. Elijah's pulse pounded in his ears, not out of fear, but in anticipation of a confrontation that was long overdue. He met Lucas's challenge with a steady gaze, refusing to let the group's malicious energy force him into a reaction he had meticulously learned to suppress. As the circle tightened, the bully's posturing gave way to an intensity that filled the narrow street with the promise of violence. Yet, instead of the fury or frantic desperation that might have erupted in an ordinary boy, Elijah's expression remained composed, calm, and unreadable. His internal monologue was a quiet litany of resolve. He would not be manipulated by their taunts. He would neither cry out nor cower. Every memory of past bruises and whispered insults melded into a single, unyielding determination to define himself on his own terms. In that moment, the dynamic shifted imperceptibly but irrevocably. The bullies, who had long relied on fear and anticipation to assert their dominance, found themselves momentarily disarmed by Elijah's unflinching silence. Though Lucas's smile remained fixed in place, a veneer of confidence that masked a deep-seated uncertainty, Elijah sensed that the balance of power was beginning to tilt. The confrontation was not yet physical, but the psychological battleground had been redrawn. This was the turning point, the moment when the outsider started to become the one who set the terms of engagement. As the group lingered in the fading light, the tension slowly diffused into an uneasy stalemate. With one final, measured look at his aggressors, Elijah turned and walked away, his steps resonating with the quiet promise of change. The night reclaimed its silence, but for Elijah, a new chapter had begun, a chapter where fear was replaced by determination, and every hostile whisper became fuel for a transformative journey. It happened on an overcast afternoon when the clouds gathered as if to mirror the brewing storm within the halls of Willow Creek High. In the midst of yet another day fraught with quiet hostilities, Brandon, a hulking figure and one of Lucas's most loyal henchmen, made his move. As Elijah navigated the crowded hallway between classes, Brandon suddenly lunged forward with a wild swing aimed to knock him off balance. The impact was swift, the intent unmistakable. This was a test of Elijah's resolve, a physical assertion of the power the bullies wielded. In that split second, time slowed. Elijah's instincts, honed by months of silent observation and rigorous training in his garage, took over. He sidestepped with fluid grace, barely a ripple in the fabric of the hallway, his movements measured and controlled. The shock on Brandon's face was immediate. This wasn't the reaction he had anticipated. Where others might have reacted with anger or tears, Elijah's calm defiance sent a clear message. He was no longer the meek, quiet boy who would silently endure humiliation. A hush fell over the small cluster of onlookers. Students, who had long whispered about him in corners and corridors, now gaped in silent disbelief. Elijah's every movement exuded a confidence that was both alien and magnetic, a quiet power born not of violence, but of restraint and discipline. As Brandon recovered from his missed punch, his next attempt was met with a deft counter, a controlled shift in Elijah's weight that sent the aggressor stumbling backwards, his momentum undone by a precision that spoke of months spent perfecting every strike and dodge. In that moment, the dynamics of power shifted palpably. The bullies, who had previously assumed an effortless superiority, found themselves facing a challenge they hadn't anticipated. Lucas's smirk faltered, his eyes widening in a mix of shock and dawning realization. The whispers that had long accompanied Elijah's presence in the hallways transformed into murmurs of awe. This was not the reaction of a victim, but of someone who had mastered his own strength. Elijah did not raise his voice or launch into a flurry of retaliatory blows. Instead, he remained poised, his breathing steady and his gaze focused. He offered no taunts or threats, only a silent promise that he would not be intimidated. The physical confrontation, though brief, had redefined the boundaries of respect within the school's social hierarchy. For a moment, every student in the corridor became a witness to the emergence of a quiet warrior, one who had transformed pain into purpose and fear into a formidable strength. As the corridor slowly filled with tentative applause and murmured reverence, Brandon and the others exchanged uncertain glances. The battle lines had been drawn not with shouted challenges or fierce roars, but with a single, elegant display of controlled power that left no doubt. Elijah Carter was no longer a passive target. He was a force to be reckoned with, a trained fighter whose calm and precision had silenced the bullies and ignited a spark of hope among the onlookers. With the incident still fresh in everyone's mind, Elijah gathered his books and continued to class. Each step he took resonated with newfound purpose. The first strike had been delivered, and while the physical confrontation might have ended in moments, the ripple effects were just beginning. In the hearts of those who had watched, a quiet revolution was underway, one that promised to reshape not only the dynamics of power in Willow Creek High, but also the way in which every marginalized soul would come to see their own strength. In the days following that pivotal confrontation, the hallways of Willow Creek High transformed into a silent coliseum of whispers and glances. Rumors of Elijah's calm, yet devastating counterattacks spread rapidly, carried on the winds of both awe and trepidation. The once dominant presence of Lucas and his crew began to crumble, replaced by a hesitant uncertainty that marred their every interaction. Students, who had for so long regarded the bullies with a mix of fear and resignation, now found themselves watching Elijah with a mixture of admiration and envy. The battle lines, once clearly drawn by cruelty and exclusion, were being redrawn with every hushed conversation and furtive nod. Elijah's newfound defiance ignited a subtle shift in the social fabric of the school. In classrooms, hallways, and even the quiet corners of the library, whispers of respect for the quiet warrior grew louder. Teachers, too, began to notice the remarkable transformation in the boy who had once been a shadow on the fringes of school life. His steady resolve and unwavering composure became symbols of resilience, a silent challenge to the oppressive dynamics that had long governed the interactions between students. Yet the bullies were not ones to accept defeat quietly. Behind closed doors, Lucas, Brandon, and their remaining cohorts gathered, their faces etched with a mixture of anger and disbelief. Their carefully constructed hierarchy was under threat, and they resolved to reclaim the power they had lost. In hushed, conspiratorial tones, they plotted a renewed campaign of intimidation, one that would test Elijah's resolve to its breaking point. Every calculated act of aggression, every planned act of defiance against his growing influence, was meticulously designed to restore the old order. But for every malicious plan the bullies conceived, Elijah's determination only grew stronger. Late into the night, In the solitude of his modest room and the echoing quiet of his garage, he practiced relentlessly. Every jab, every defensive maneuver was a step toward not just physical strength, but a deep-seated confidence that could no longer be undermined by fear. His training was no longer merely an escape. It was a declaration that he would stand firm against any force that sought to diminish him. As the days turned into weeks, the tension in the corridors escalated. On one hand, there were those who once cowered in the shadows, now emboldened by Elijah's silent courage. On the other, the bullies, shaken by their previous failures, lurked in the background with renewed hostility. In this environment, every interaction, every sidelong glance became a silent challenge, a test of the shifting balance of power. The battle lines, though drawn in whispers and fleeting glances, had become irrevocable. Elijah was no longer just the new kid, he was a symbol of resilience. And as every student took note of his unwavering composure, a quiet but profound shift began to occur, a transformation that would soon culminate in a confrontation where the true measure of character would be laid bare for all to see. It was a crisp, electric afternoon when the final confrontation unfolded, as if the very air of Willow Creek High vibrated with the promise of retribution. The tension had reached a fever pitch. Elijah stepped outside after the final bell, and a gathering of figures waited for him on the open lawn. Lucas, Brandon, and 3 other members of the old guard formed a semicircle, their eyes burning with a mixture of defiance and desperation. A crowd of students, drawn by whispers of the imminent showdown, slowly encircled the scene, their murmurs rising like a tide of anticipation. For a long moment, the silence was complete, the kind of silence that precedes the eruption of long-simmering conflict. The bullies advanced in a coordinated, predatory manner, every muscle tense, every step deliberate. Lucas's voice broke the stillness, dripping with scorn and challenge. "Time to prove you're not all talk, Carter." His words were both an invitation and a threat, an ultimatum that left no room for ambiguity. Elijah's response was measured. He drew a slow, deliberate breath, centering himself. Every muscle in his body was honed by weeks of relentless training, his mind sharpened by the determination that had carried him through countless days of isolation and ridicule. As Brandon lunged forward, Elijah's body moved with the grace of a practiced fighter. He intercepted the blow with a precision that left the onlookers gasping. Every dodge, every block was a silent testament to his transformation from victim to victor. The confrontation escalated with a series of rapid exchanges, a blur of swift movements and calculated counters. The bullies, expecting a chaotic brawl filled with shouts and fury, were taken aback by Elijah's calm intensity. He moved not with wild abandon, but with the disciplined focus of someone who had long mastered his own fear. One by one, he disarmed their attacks. A block here, a counter there. Each motion was controlled, deliberate, as if he were rewriting the very rules of the game. The crowd watched, spellbound, as the balance of power shifted visibly with every graceful maneuver. Finally, as the skirmish reached its zenith, Lucas found himself alone in the center of the makeshift arena. His eyes, once alight with unchallenged arrogance, now flickered with uncertainty. With deliberate slowness, Elijah advanced. "I told you," he said quietly, his voice carrying over the hushed assembly. "I'm not interested in proving anything." In that moment, the strength of his resolve was undeniable. The confrontation, once a battle of brute force and intimidation, had transformed into a statement of principle, a declaration that respect was earned not by violence, but by the courage to stand firm in one's own truth. The final confrontation did not end with shouts or cries for vengeance. Instead, as Lucas hesitated, his defiant facade crumbling, the assembled students realized that something fundamental had shifted. The oppressive hierarchy that had once defined the corridors of Willow Creek High was crumbling before their eyes. With Lucas retreating into the shadows alongside his cohorts, Elijah stood alone, exhausted but unbowed, a quiet beacon of resilience amid the dissipating storm of violence. In the wake of that fateful afternoon, the atmosphere at Willow Creek High began to change in ways that no one could have foreseen. The echoes of the final confrontation resonated through the corridors like a heartbeat, a steady, rhythmic pulse of transformation that subtly altered the power dynamics within the school. By the next morning, whispers of Elijah's bravery and the remarkable display of discipline had spread through every classroom and corridor. The bullies, once the undisputed rulers of the school's social hierarchy, were noticeably absent from their usual haunts. Their once imposing presence had evaporated, replaced by an aura of uncertainty and retreat. Students who had long felt marginalized began to see Elijah not only as a fighter, but as a symbol of resilience and change. In hallways where fear had once reigned, nods of respect and quiet smiles began to replace the stares of disdain. Teachers, too, seemed to regard him with a newfound respect, their interactions now tinged with subtle acknowledgement of his strength and perseverance. In the aftermath of the altercation, even those who had remained silent for so long found the courage to speak up, if only in hushed tones, about the injustice they had witnessed and the hope that Elijah's actions had ignited. For Elijah, the shift in power was bittersweet. The road that had led him to that decisive moment had been fraught with pain and isolation, yet it had also forged a strength that he had never known he possessed. Walking through the halls, he felt the weight of a silent transformation, a collective awakening that even the most entrenched prejudices could be challenged by a single act of courage. Though he never sought the spotlight, his quiet defiance had sparked a movement, a recalibration of the social order that began with respect and ended with genuine admiration. The legacy of that final confrontation rippled far beyond the immediate circle of onlookers. In classrooms, students now engaged in discussions that transcended the petty squabbles of high school life. They began to question the values that had once dictated their interactions, opening their minds to a broader understanding of strength, compassion, and the power of standing up for one's dignity. As the days turned to weeks, the oppressive atmosphere of exclusion gave way to tentative steps toward inclusion, a small but significant victory in the ongoing battle against prejudice. In quiet moments of reflection, Elijah recognized that the shift in power was not merely about physical confrontations or social hierarchies. It was about the reclamation of identity. He had evolved from the timid new kid into a symbol of hope for those who had long suffered in silence. And as he continued his journey, he understood that true power lay not in the ability to strike fear into the hearts of others, but in the courage to rise above hatred and to inspire change in even the darkest of places. As the season slowly changed, so too did the contours of life at Willow Creek High. For Elijah Carter, the journey that had begun with quiet trepidation had evolved into something far greater than he had ever imagined. No longer was he defined solely by the scars of bullying or the label of new kid. He had become a symbol of resilience, a quiet force whose actions resonated in the hearts of his peers and even the teachers who once saw him as an outsider. Each day, as he walked through the now familiar halls, there was an undeniable shift in the way he was regarded. The nods of acknowledgement, the respectful glances, and even the timid smiles of those who had once dismissed him were gentle affirmations of a newfound status. It was as though the entire school had been transformed by the simple act of standing up for oneself. For Elijah, the journey had not been about proving his worth through violence or bravado. It had been about embracing his identity and reclaiming the power that had long been denied to him. In the quiet moments between classes, he would reflect on the trials he had faced, the subtle glances, the painful pranks, and the final confrontation that had rewritten the rules of respect. Each memory was both a reminder of the hurt he had endured and a beacon of the strength he had discovered within himself. The training sessions in his garage, the countless hours spent refining his skills and his resolve, were now symbols of an inner journey that transcended the physical realm. They had taught him that true strength was measured not in the force of a punch, but in the quiet courage to rise above adversity. As Elijah moved through the corridors of Willow Creek High, he realized that his transformation was complete. He was more than just a fighter. He was a living testament to the idea that one person's determination can alter the course of a community. The identity he had once dreaded, the label of the outsider, had been transformed into a symbol of hope and possibility. In every whispered word of admiration, in every supportive gesture from a once indifferent peer, he saw the seeds of change taking root. In the final analysis, Elijah understood that his journey was far from over. While the battles of the past had reshaped the social landscape of his school, the true challenge lay in carrying forward the lessons of resilience and dignity into every aspect of life. He vowed to use his newfound strength not as a weapon, but as a guide to help others who felt lost in the shadows of prejudice, to stand as a beacon for those who believed that change was impossible. And as he looked ahead to an uncertain future, he did so with the quiet confidence of someone who had discovered that true victory lay in being true to oneself. Elijah Carter's story, once defined by quiet suffering, had evolved into an enduring legacy of transformation. No longer was he simply the new kid at Willow Creek High. He was a symbol of what it means to be brave, to be resilient, and to claim one's place in a world that often refuses to see beyond its own prejudices. And as the gentle light of dawn broke through the windows of his classroom each morning, it illuminated not just a school building, but the promise of a future where every individual, no matter how different, could find strength in the truth of who they are. Thank you for watching until the end. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and leave a comment below. Let me know your thoughts. Your support means everything and helps bring more stories like this to life. See you in the next one.